Hey everybody, Pastor Scott back here with the response video to our lesson from last week for Hagar, Sarah, and Abraham. Oh, once again. There we go. Great responses, great thoughtful responses. Thank you for engaging with this material yet again. I appreciate the work that you are putting into it on your end. So just a couple of brief thoughts. Once again, all of your responses were all pretty similar. So you really definitely seem to be picking up on the same major points. So great job. Glad of that. We asked the question initially, what does God promise Abraham, or what does God tell Abraham besides just go leave your father's house and I'll tell you when you get there? And as you all picked up, God says, I will bless you. I will make your name great. And most importantly, I will make of you a great nation. Even though at this point in the story, Abraham has no descendants. He's married to Sarah. Sarah, as we hear, is barren and no descendants. So he's like, okay, that sounds cool. Don't get how it's going to work, but sounds good. And then time passes. And later on, Abraham's like, hey, God, you remember that story or that promise that you made me? Yeah, we haven't made any progress on that. And then God gives him a sign. He says, go out and look at the stars. God will also repeat this another time. This is a part of the story that we didn't get into, that God basically does the same thing with, first he says, look at the stars, your descendants will be like the stars in the heavens. Can they be counted? And then he does the same thing again with, look at the sand on the seashore, the grains of sand. So will your descendants be. So two different times God makes this promise to Abraham. And as we hear, Abraham believes the promise of God and it is credited to him as righteousness. Sometimes, and I think we talked about this in the original video, sometimes Abraham is known as the great example of faith, because Abraham believed the promise of God and it is credited as righteousness. Essentially, just believing God's going to do what God says that is going to happen. But despite that great tendency of Abraham to believe God, as we know, he's not perfect either. We had the issue of him trying to pawn off his wife when they're in Egypt, which we hear about. As I mentioned, that happens more than once. Also, the whole situation between that brings Hagar into the mix and into the story is also part of this too, when Abraham and Sarah try to take measures into their own hands. Now, we kind of talked about, what do you think maybe is Hagar's response to this whole thing? She doesn't really have any choice. She doesn't really have any agency. And you had some mixed thoughts on that. Some of you thought that she probably wasn't real happy about it. She probably felt used. She probably felt kind of betrayed, especially when Sarah then turns her back on her and they start butting heads. It's like, hey, you told me to do this and now you're unhappy about it. But also, one of you pointed out something that I think is a good thought. Well, maybe despite what all happened, this actually improved her life situation. And that's certainly possible. She was a slave and she becomes a wife. Now, she may not be the featured wife. She is the second wife. So of course things weren't perfect for her, but it's a valid point that, maybe things did improve. She's no longer a slave. But then as we hear, things are back and forth for her as well. Now, the last thing that we talked about is this whole idea of a family squabble that exists between the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith, and the Christian faith, and where that comes from. Well, it all comes because they all originate back to this original story. The Jewish faith traces back through Isaac to Abraham. The Muslim faith traces back through Ishmael to Abraham. And of course, Christianity originated as an offshoot from Judaism. So they are three very different faiths, very different religions, but one could argue, all look to the same God, just different expressions of the same God, different understandings of the same God, but the same God. And a little quick word on this. So these three faiths are known as the three monotheistic religions. And monotheistic, that's a big fancy word. Mono means one, and theistic or theism means God. So one God, as opposed to many gods, which is known as polytheistic or polytheism. So these three monotheistic religions all trace themselves back to the same dude, that being Abraham, which is interesting, even though we have very, very, very different understandings of our own individual faith. No questions posed on sermon notes this time. Remember to stay on those sermon notes. And if you are a little bit behind on those, you can always catch up and send them to me later and still get credit for them. So just note that that's going on. But thanks for another great week, everybody. Look for the next one coming out here, going into the weekend here in a couple more days. Thanks.